Well, all right, my friends, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap. I am very excited to share this conversation today. My guest is Professor Daniel Horowitz. He is a professor of American Studies at Smith College. He has written a ton of books over the years on things like consumer culture, American social criticism, and the kind of intersection of pop culture and ideology. His latest book is what we're talking about today. It's called American Dreams, American Nightmares, Culture and Crisis in Residential Real Estate from the Great Recession to the COVID-19 Pandemic. You know we love talking about housing on this show and sort of the difference between houses and homes and what that reveals about American history. But Professor Horowitz has like a lifetime of scholarship and insights to share with us. And he's also been watching a lot of reality TV. He tells us about these HGTV shows. I don't know if you've seen any of this shit, but it's kind of insane. The names are hilarious. The names of these shows are like Flip or Flop, Fixer to Fabulous, Farmhouse Fixer, Hot Mess House, Love It or List It. And there are a million others. And what Professor Horowitz and I get into in this conversation is how those shows tell us a lot about where we're at in terms of thinking about houses as commodities and homes as something different. We also get into like the whole work from home thing and how that's changing what we think of as the home space. There's so much here. So this was really fun. I hope you enjoy it. We got lots of cool stuff going on the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page and on our YouTube channel. Go check all that stuff out. I've got links in the episode description, but I've been putting up videos I call Trap TV about all sorts of stuff. So I appreciate the everyone who's checking that stuff out and subscribing to the show, etc. It means everything to me, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Professor Daniel Horowitz. Daniel Horowitz, thank you so much for joining me. Good to see you.
My pleasure, David. Glad to be here.
You've written a number of books over the years, and all of them honestly caught my attention because they, in one way or another, each one of your books intersects with a lot of the things we've talked about on this show, and including, just the history of consumerism and consumer life, but consumerism as an ideology as well. But your latest book is something that I maybe we can start with because it's about housing, and we've been talking about housing a lot lately during COVID, and you've written a book about it. It's called American Dreams, American Nightmares, Culture and Crisis in Residential Real Estate from the Great Recession to the COVID-19 Pandemic. That sounds like a lot of bad news. What got you thinking about sort of centering all your life of thinking about consumerism into housing and thinking about homes and housing? I think those are two different things, but
yes. Well, weird as it seems, on any given day when I have downtime, I sit on the couch and watch junk TV. And my wife, also a historian, Helen Lefkowitz Horowitz, says that if I go through and write the biography of Dr. Phil, she'll divorce me. But this book, in some ways, comes out of my watching HGTV. When I have that downtime, I like shows that have a beginning, middle, and end, half an hour, just in time to refresh. But in a larger sense, this book follows on my two previous ones. The three of them, that is on residential real estate, entrepreneurship, and happiness, really all centering on U.S. history since, let's say, the mid-'70s, and the reconfiguration of the culture and politics and economics away from the positive role of government and towards the positive role of self-governance. To use the word neoliberal would be a shorthand for what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and with neoliberalism, it seems like there's a million different ways of defining that. But where do we throw the consumer in there as a sort of figure or subject or object?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the fundamental changes that happened in the last 50 years or so is that as the public sphere was weakened, as labor unions were undermined, you remember when Reagan took over, one of the first things he did was try to destroy the union. And so beginning in the 70s, as the public sphere, as a commitment to a positive role of government, support for organized labor, et cetera, as those things wane, in order for people, many people, tens of millions of them, to sustain their well-being, had to find ways of structuring their lives. And as consumers, that meant on taking increasing amounts of debt, debt in order to underwrite higher education, home ownership, especially as housing prices escalated. I often think of the metric I carry around in my mind, which is when my wife and I moved to Southern California to teach at Scripps College in 1973 for 3 times the beginning assistant professor salary, which was $12,000. We could buy a 3-bedroom, 3 times that. We could buy a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, 3 times an assistant professor salary. Try that now almost any place in the United States. So the debt, consumer debt especially, credit card debt, mortgage debt, 2 very different things, took on increasingly large role for tens of millions of people to sustain what they were pursuing, a decent life.
How does that how does that change our perception of what's possible in America? Because when I think about the drive for home ownership, and home ownership is sort of a central as a central mechanism for wealth creation in America, I think of it as like, that's a post-World War II phenomenon in some ways. I mean, I know a lot of the ideological ideas about home ownership predate that, but what changes in the 70s that kind of delivered us into the period we are now, where homes have become a very, very different thing to us? Because it seems like in a lot of ways we've seen them commodified. Part of what you're writing about in this book is about Airbnbs and about house flipping, and sort of like these things as objects for wealthy people to move around in one way or another. At the same time, they're also homes for people.
Right. And not just wealthy people, of course. But yes, absolutely. The financialization, another fancy term, the financialization of American life is absolutely central to this story. That in an earlier, and I'm very aware as I say all this of the title of your program with the word nostalgia, and I don't want to overemphasize how wonderful things were before 1970. And I think so much of the revision of historical knowledge has come to see that previous period, from the New Deal to the Great Society, in more problematic ways. But in any event, what happens after what I just described a few minutes ago, as people took on more debt, financial institutions had to develop ways of raising, packaging, supporting, selling that debt. And more they turned to financialization, so that on the side of the homeowner or the home pursuer, the home became more and more of a commodity, not a real physical place to live in, but as you said a minute ago, but a place that could be flipped, that could be transformed into a commodity and bought and sold, and without the kind of physical attachment to it. I talk in the book about, I think I've lived in, although not all of them owned, very few of them owned, I've lived in 20 or 30 places in my life.
Right.
My parents didn't. My parents lived basically in 2 or 3. So that on the consumer side, the homeowner side, the house becomes more and more a commodity and less a real thing to which one is attached for generations. On the finance side, it was necessary to develop financial instruments. And that starts in the 1970s. at Salomon Brothers, you have to develop financial instruments that became more and more obscure, perilous. I think about them, and I don't fully understand them, mortgage-backed securities and
Yeah.
collateral debt obligations, but they are bets upon bets upon bets. When I bought our first home in Claremont in 1973, when we bought it, I went to a bank and they underwrote the purchase of that bank, of that house. They wrote a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage. And I suspect they kept it on their books for until we moved. But that doesn't happen now. Now, what happens now is whoever originates the loan, and it's often not a bank, then flips it, just as the house is flipped, so that the mortgage is flipped and packaged and repackaged and repackaged, and then becomes part of a portfolio of someone in South Africa who's at the pension fund. And that's financialization. So on the homeowner's side, the home becomes a commodity. And on the finance side, it becomes something more and more abstracted, distant from a piece of paper.
It's really, to me, it's really interesting to think about the kind of what is the connection or disconnection, or I guess dialectic would be the fancy term for the home and the house, because it seems like there's kind of a paradox here, which is, the home as a place that has all these ideas of family in it, that has, to borrow like a Benjamin term, like aura to it. It has something intangible that gives it value. But then it's also like this object that can be sold to a million different banks that financialize it. And so it's just a kind of token within this financial system. It seems like that's an irreconcilable thing in some ways. And I don't know, it almost explains our kind of housing crisis in a sense, because we're trying to do two very different things with these objects.
Yeah, the first, if you go back to Catherine Beecher or Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, the first home has a spiritual, and in the 19th century, certainly a religious meaning to it, something that one was passionate about, that believed in, and has I'll use the word sacramental, but has a spiritual meaning to it. A house isn't that. A house is something bought and sold and flipped, which is something I write about. And yes, those are two things. And there's a tension. Absolutely. There's a tension between the two. And as you know, at the beginning of the book, I had a third, which is homeland, which is the role of house and home in the nation, and the word homeland security in reaction to the part of the war on terror, although not really about individual homes or houses, but it is about the homeland, the nation. So you've got a third very intensely impacted and believed in part of this homeland. So absolutely. And there's tension between them. You can't, sometimes protecting one of them and making one of them sacred jeopardizes the other.
Right. Yeah. Like I'm just thinking about like a house that's just outfitted entirely with security cameras and everyone's gunned up, ready to protect it. It's like, how cozy is this home? How much does this feel warm to be in? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of expressing the tension between these different meanings. And I think it works itself out in everyday lives, not just at banks, but in people's lives, which is you feel warm and cozy, but you also feel threatened that the bank may take it away, threatened that a home invader may come in, threatened that the climate change may cause it to be burned down, whatever. So absolutely, I think the tension between these various meanings.
What makes a house a home and vice versa. I those shows that you watch on HGTV, I love. To me, those are such key texts. Like if scholars aren't watching that type of stuff, then how are they ever going to understand any kind of social, cultural, political phenomenon in America? They're such. I mean, whenever I see shows like that, I'm kind of like, wow, I'm learning so much here. But what's the on that show? What's the conception of house versus home on that show? Because it seems like so much of what it's about. I mean, of those shows that are like reality programs are often like about couples that are looking for a home and they're trying to build something for themselves. That I mean, there's a kind of entrepreneurial spirit to it, but it seems like those couples are often looking for both. They're looking for a good investment and some sort of warm, cozy place.
Absolutely. I think you got it absolutely right. I mean, one of the things, well, the three I focus on, although that hardly encompasses all those I watch, are Property Brothers, Flipper Flop, and the Fixer Upper. They're very different. There are others I watch. And I watch for a number of things. I watch for the role of gender. Very often it's the man who's the builder and the woman who's the designer.
Yeah.
I watch for the role of race and sexuality and how those are often obliterated. But yes, one of the things that fascinates me, going back to the larger context, is financialization is usually, not always, but on the part of the homeowner, financialization is off screen. That is, there is a lot of attention paid on these shows to how much money the entrepreneur, the Gaineses, for instance, or Almusas, or the Property Brothers are making, but very little attention, almost none, to the homeowners taking on enormous debt, and where that you don't see in these shows people going to banks and trying to negotiate. So that seems off and off screen, as do a lot of things. But the home becomes, I think you're right, it becomes in many of these shows a sanctified place. That is a home. And you see that in the attention to detail, the intensity with which people are pursuing these. But it also becomes a house. And one of the things that fascinates me is that the people who develop the hosts of the show, this is unimaginable to me, go and pick out all the design elements. They go pick out the dishes, the artwork, and then at the moment of reveal, people come into the house and they ostensibly love everything. I can't imagine giving up to someone else, even an interior decorator, those very personal choices. But that is a kind of abstraction, right? Not financialization quite, but it is about how the home becomes a commodity, how someone turns over to someone else all those crucial decisions. But it's also going back to neoliberalism. It seems to me that these shows promote the notion of self-governance. That is the ability of the couple, and it's almost always a couple, not always a straight couple, but almost always a couple. Some shows offer many more examples of gays and lesbians and many more examples of interracial couples or African Americans. Others don't at all. But you see in these choices the couple, and it's usually a couple abstracted. You rarely see their children. They're often in the house and they're talking about this is the bedroom for this child or that, but you don't see the child. You don't see the parents who might be helping with financing. It is abstracting in many ways, the purchasing couple and then putting them in this sanctified home that is in reality also a house. So I don't think on the producer side, I don't think that's how they think about this. I'm fascinated by what's off screen. I'm fascinated by how labor is off screen. That is, you usually see the hosting couple doing all the hard labor. And in the background, you see, in the case of the Gaineses, for instance, you see the Latino workers, but you rarely hear them speak. Although they're occasionally spoken to. And on Hometown, I don't know if you watched that. This is about Meridian, Mississippi, a minority town. The two hosts are a kind of middle-aged white couple. you almost never see an African American worker,
Mm.
and relatively rarely African American homeowners. So there's a lot. These shows are not representations of reality, if we will, but
Right.
what they show and what they hide is very significant.
Well, I mean, they're TV shows and they exist in TV land, and the intersection between that and the actual suburbs and the actual, construction of these spaces is fascinating to me. I think a lot about Disneyland and its impact on architecture, but not beyond that, the sort of just like movie set kind of environment that you're on a movie set, and it makes total sense to me that people would want the place designed for them. I mean, the impulse of designing your own home seems so homespun and natural to me. But on the other end of it, it seems like there is a desire for people to live in kind of a place that's been curated and sanitized for them. I had a
Go ahead.
friend whose parents moved into one of the model homes in a new tract neighborhood, and it already was decorated for them, including a big children's room that had a big like letters, puffy letters on the wall that said Megan. And I said, "Who's Megan?" And all of a sudden said, "I don't know. There's no Megan here." But they left it up. And I thought that was bizarre. But obviously there's some impulse to live in that kind of environment. It's so weird.
That's what I never thought of, the movie set and Hollywood. Obviously, I mean, you're obviously absolutely right. I've never had the pleasure. I can't imagine living that way. Our where I'm sitting is so layered with memories that are so specific. So as I can see in your background as well.
Yeah, you've got a kind of, I don't know, I've got to have an earthy, organic feel, but I mean, maybe that's just a personal taste thing.
No, I don't think it's. I actually early in the book, I have a picture of my computer screen and what's in back of it, and what's in back of it. Up high is a picture of me and my wife getting married, and of our children before they left home, and of all the books that inspire and terrorize me. I'm sure it's the same with you. I never thought about that as a movie set, and I'm sure that if we knew enough about the biographies of the producers and directors of these shows on HGTV, we could track some of them back to inspiration from movies and movie sets. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like keeping the picture that comes with the frame just in your and putting up on the wall. Yes. I was thinking something that might be an obvious point too, and I'm sure I know you get into this in your latest book about houses and how COVID has changed our conception of what a home is, because I guess the other element is work, right? Like it's kind of like it has to be an office now, and that seems like a profound change in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, at the end of the book, and it's problematic because I had to hand that in March, 18 months ago. At the end of the book, I have a chapter on the impact of COVID on housing. And part of that, obviously, is work from home. Mm-hmm. And with so many other things, what COVID did was intensify and accelerate conditions already going on. I started this book when I was able to go out into the world. And one of the chapters is on these workshops. I went to 3 of them in person, workshops about house flipping, where I pretended I was a potential house flipper. But the 2/3 of the rest of the book is all written either from online and a lot of it from the public library, because I couldn't get books out of a university library for a while. But, you and I are more used to working from home, and that's not an unfamiliar thing. But and this had already begun to change before COVID, that is, work from home had begun to change, but it's been enormously accelerated. And that has, as you know, tremendous implications for commercial real estate, which is emptying out, for your choice about where to live, that you now need more space. If you have 3 kids and you were in a 2-bedroom home, and you and your spouse are working from home, that calls for a reconfiguration. You need more space, or you have to reconfigure rooms in a major way. But what COVID also did was accelerate a whole series of other changes of the relationship between public and private, between commerce and privacy. Think about Amazon. Amazon existed before all this happened, but most people shopped more and more online with COVID.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
I remember the early, my God, I'm sure everyone has a date. Ours is March 16th, 2020. That's the date. I'm sure everyone has this date. That's
mine
the
is the 12th. Yeah.
Okay. But the 16th is the day we made the major decision. But I talk in the book about, I have an email to a friend on the 8th or 9th, where I say, I'm not really worried. I mean, I'm a little worried, but not that worried. And I remember being on the LA Metro, and all of a sudden, this is probably around the 10th or 11th, realizing what jeopardy I might be in. But who knew? Who knew fully? But COVID accelerated all this. Telemedicine, the way shopping, buying a home without actually going there, which became quite common because you could walk through a house. I go on realtor.com all the time, or Zillow, when you can actually walk through the house. Not all houses, but yeah. And that all those things, the use of new technology, Airbnb predates all this. But it was accelerated. The COVID accelerated our reliance on new technologies to find out where we live, how we survive. All of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but over time.
Yeah. I mean, and to me, the idea of the office being at home is one that is so transformative, because it doesn't seem like we're really going back to that. You have I mean, I think a lot about New York City because I spent so much time there, and so many people I know are still there. But it's interesting to watch, like, the mayor and the governor kind of thinking we need to go back to the offices and trying to push that line. But I think the last time I checked, only about half of people have gone back to those offices. And with a city whose economy is strapped to commercial real estate, it's unclear what to do with that stuff. I mean, the activist in me is sort of like, well, turn those places into homes, but it's that you don't get the tax revenue from homes in the same way that you get with commercial real estate, as I understand it.
Yeah, you're touching on a whole bunch. I don't think we'll ever go back to normal. I don't. What I wonder, and I'm sure you do, what normal is anyway. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know what my life is going to be like a year from now. But you're touching on a number of things. One is commercial real estate. That companies, when the lease comes up, they're not going to renew the lease because they don't need the same space. If their workers, especially mind workers, tech workers, come in one day a week or not at all, you don't need that kind of space. It affects traffic on highways. It affects the use of public transportation. There was a lot of talk in 2021 about the end of the American city.
Right.
And I don't think that's happened. There was a lot of talk about the move to the suburbs. Houses in suburbs escalated in prices, but I don't think that's panned out to be true. But
weren't people declaring the end of the American city in the 70s as well?
I'm sure. I remember early discussions when self-driving cars first came on. I remember predictions. Well, think of all those parking lots. No one is going to own a car anymore because they're going to use these temporary cars. But commercial real estate is being transformed. In some cases, what you touched on is true, which is they are being turned into, just as shopping centers, some of them are turned into community colleges. Some office buildings are being repurposed as residences, but there's tremendous vacancy rate. The New York Times had an article on that just recently. I think for people like you and me, who probably were working when we weren't teaching, we're working from home anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't as dramatic a change as it is for people who were commuting. And that's another issue. If you don't have to commute, if you don't need a suit, if I still have my slippers on as I'm I'm fully dressed otherwise, but that affects all sorts of things, of decorum, of personal relations.
Yeah.
Water cooler conversations as productive moments in a company, all of that. But it affects where we live. I think as I was preparing for this, I went back to the last sentence in the book, and which I'd rewrite now. I'd rewrite, this is quoting the final sentence, quote, "Not just reimagine how we achieve long-held dreams of living comfortably and safely at home in the new reality we face." If I were rewriting that, I'm struck by having written that at a much more intensive period of the impact of COVID. And I still couldn't figure out, or in my imagination, it was home and it wasn't going out in the wider world yet.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And what that transition is like, because there's a bizarre dissonance right now, I feel like, because COVID is still around, but we're not doing any of the lockdown type measures that we had been done before. It doesn't feel like there's a big public push to do much about it besides suggest people get booster shots. And so when I go to the grocery store lately, it's a mix of masks and no masks. And there's sort of like, I don't know, it almost seems like a reflection of that larger sort of trend of the last, I don't know, everything since the New Deal and maybe the Great Society, is that the decline of like any sense of a public or any sense of a coherent national purpose. I don't know. Sometimes I get nervous when there's a coherent national purpose, but you know what I'm describing, right?
Yes,
it seems like, and so much of what you're talking about when working from home, and it accelerates that sort of extracting ourselves from any responsibility to one another. We used to go to the movie theater. Now we watch Netflix. We used to go to the shopping malls and the arcades. Now we just do it on Amazon. It seems like a recipe for, I know I'm not the only person saying this, but it seems like a recipe for a very like lonely, alienated society, and one that doesn't really have a solidarity with each other at all.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the way both the new technologies and then intensified by COVID and other forces, the way all of that changed the relationship between public and private and undermined, and this didn't happen on March 10th or March 16th, 2020, as you hint with the New Deal. War is the health of the state. And as one of our friends said, and Randolph Bourne, and as you hinted at, sometimes that analogy, let's have a war on poverty, let's have a war to end all wars, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but it did express a national purpose. And it's very hard now for you and me as historians and other people as citizens to remember there were times when the nation could come together with public commitments, sometimes for good, not always, and have that sense of common purpose. And I think it's clear from COVID that we lack that now, because this has to do with American politics now as well. But you're absolutely right. I think that COVID, but not COVID alone, financialization, the undermining of core institutions, the family, trade unions, and others, the less dependence on the government as a support system, all of that, and new technologies, and COVID dramatically changed or intensified the relationship between public and private. And that, when I read that last sentence of the book, I think, what am I thinking about? I was still, my life is very good, but it's a very private life with lots of friends. Yeah.
Well, I mean, isn't that the American dream in some way? And it feels like, I know the American dream has evolved over time, but it seems like the contradiction in the entire American project is how you create a society of rugged individuals who are all sort of pursuing their own homes and happiness, on their own, but also create somehow a democratic society that functions and we all have to sacrifice and cooperate for. It just seems like those contradictions come out even stronger now when we have such a hyper individual society.
That's right. And I think that's neoliberalism, to use that word, is part of it.
There you go.
I grew up I was born in 1938, and there was a Joe Davidson little statue of Franklin Roosevelt in our living room. I grew up in my grandparents moved in from the Socialist Party to the Democratic Party in 1932. I grew up in a household very shaped by a very copious public arena and public engagement by parents, which I've tried to, against some odds, tried to sustain in my own life. But I think that tension, pulled as we all are in different ways for different historical reasons and social reasons, pulled in both ways between an intense privatism and a commitment to something in the public, whether it's through a church or a mosque or a synagogue or politics or whatever. I think that is central in American history, and that goes back and forth. And we are, I think since 1970, since the 70s, we have been in a period when privatism and self-governance has been more and more in the saddle.
Well, I mean, there are so many different branches of that to think about. I'm thinking about the era that you lived through, right? Which is seeing the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement come and counterculture and sort of transforming that. I wonder, do we blame the hippies? Do we blame the counterculture for sort of sending us in? I mean, it's kind of a supreme irony, I think, in a lot of ways, that all that rock and roll culture that I grew up, a little bit later, but I grew up sort of in the shadow of the 60s, 70s, 80s punk rock kind of culture that looked at government and looked at all that stuff as corrupt and just cynical kind of attitude towards it. There was, in other words, by the time I joined the cultural conversation, all that sort of like echoes of socialism and unions was something that existed in the past. And that's a pretty dramatic thing. And that reading about the New Left, that's how so many of the fights were about in the 60s, were about dropping that old socialist factory leftism and moving towards something more cultural. And it just looks different to me now.
So in Gary, I don't know if you've read it, Gary Gerstl's a new book, Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. He says, and it struck me as odd, but as you talk, it makes sense. He says that the New Left was one of the elements, not just Milton Friedman, but one of the elements that created the neoliberal order that was behind it. And he goes over some of the early New Left writing, the Port Huron statement, to look at that. And as you talk, I understand it even more.
Oh, good. That's very.
Struck me when I read it in this book. I said, "Oh, that doesn't make sense." The New Left was committed to the public sphere, but I think you're absolutely right that the counterculture did work against that. Why bother with government when you could tune in and drop out?
Yeah, it's weird because it's like I'm just thinking of like figures like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and they wrote about that socialist past. It was obviously they grew up in that, and yet at the same time they were also these rugged individualists that wanted to drop out and do drugs and experience the kind of visceral sensation of life. It seems like that sort of that outlook won. In some ways, even though people are obviously still fighting about government, and politics still exists, but that old kind of conception of what the left is, it explains, I think, a lot of why the left is so weak in America, in part because that TV impulse is so strong.
But as I listen to you, isn't it ironic, if that's the right word, to think of that in conjunction with free market conservative ideology of Milton Friedman, that what it would mean to think of those things, two things coming together to bring us where we are now. That's filled with irony, and got to be very careful how we talk about that. Yeah,
it is, because you've written about this consumer, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, it's like the irony of Kerouac and Ginsberg and other figures like that. They unleash the individual, but they unleash a consumer, and someone who, the forces of capitalism are more than ready to adjust themselves and sell to, and that's the whole like Thomas Frank, the Conquest of Cool was the book about that. But Mad Men treads on that territory as well.
Yes.
But you wrote a book about in this recent trilogy called Happier, that's about sort of the pursuit of happiness. It seems like it's connected to this because I feel like that impulse has only accelerated with digital technology.
Yes. So Happier, the book, which had a question mark in the title after the word
happier,
happier, because so it's really about the rise of a field called positive psychology, and of which there is a variety of political perspectives. On the left, especially in Britain, the study of happiness is linked to social democracy. That is, it's clear from all the research that once you reach a certain income level, and I'm sure it varies person to person, but it seems to be in the somewhere between 100 and 200,000, additional dollars doesn't matter very much in terms of people's happiness. Well, if that's true, and we know from studies of happiness in Northern Europe, in the Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries, that having a division between rich and poor, not as horrendous as it is in this country, increases social trust and a sense of national happiness. So that on the left, the students of happiness say, well, if additional for the very wealthy, if for Jeff Bezos or even someone worth a mere billion, can another 100 million mean anything in terms of happiness? And the answer is no, it's marginally tiny. That's on the left. On the right, people who study happiness say it's all about individual self-fulfillment and pursuit of that. But the study of happiness is an immense field, and at its extreme, although I think COVID has changed this, at its extreme, it meant that we are in this extraordinary moment when Martin Seligman calls it a Florentine moment, when hundreds of millions of people are being pulled out of poverty, or billions of people pulled out of poverty in this third world, and hundreds of millions into the middle class. And this is what he said before the rise of authoritarianism and the spread of COVID. It all looked wonderful and grand. And so happiness is certainly individual happiness, which is a very individualistic notion, as you can imagine, is certainly part of that equation that has an ascendancy in the 80s and 90s. It becomes the number of books. Scott, if you and I as historians could write a book, and at the back of it you would have 5 pages mostly blank where you could say, here are the lessons I learned from this book, and this is what I'm going to do, because our books were both scholarly and how-to books, and that's not something, I don't know of any historian who does that, but psychologists do that.
Yeah, it makes me think. What is happiness? And so much. It really makes me think that so much of happiness in America is connected to family and home and conceptions that have been around for a very, very long time that have only kind of have all these sort of different brands of consumer capital laid over them over the years, but for the most part, the impulses are always the same. That the house would be happiness, at least.
Yeah, and which, given its precarity, has become more and more problematic. I mean,
right.
Yes.
How happy can we be? I mean, you were talking about China just now, like kind of the notion of, okay, well, we've moved all these people from rural poverty into massive, basically housing projects where they live in these, these little boxes. I mean, I guess that was the folk song in the 60s about suburban homes too. It was like, how happy can we be in these little boxes? Because I mean, there's irony upon irony here in terms of capitalism versus communism and what can be delivered to a society in terms of standardization, etc. Because you look at those little boxes of the 1950s post-war suburbs, and you think, well, what's the difference in terms of just sort of assuming that a little box for our family to live in is happiness?
Yeah. I think speaking of post-war suburbs, we ought to talk a little bit about race.
Yeah.
The gap between whites and African Americans in earnings, average Black or African American earns about 60% of the average white. But in home ownership, and remember, home ownership is the principal way people accumulate wealth in this country. There, African Americans accumulate wealth at the rate of about 10% of what whites do. And the home ownership rates, those rates reached a high near 70% in the society before the financial crash. But that, you got to take those numbers apart. And for Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, it's in the high 40s. For non-Hispanic whites, it's in the mid 70s. So that, and that has to do, this goes back, as you well know, to government policy, to some of the most important progressive legislation and rules of the New Deal, as you know, were shot through with racist assumptions. Redlining is something that is the designation of different neighborhoods implicitly and sometimes explicitly by race for the risk associated with that for a bank to finance was structured along racial lines. And when that gets embedded in a society, it's very hard to change. And there have been, I talk about in the book, all sorts of legislation since the 30s that's tried to change that, but not very successfully. And COVID, as you well know, affected different people differentially. And African American, poor people, African Americans suffered much more greatly. And in so much of what's happened in the Great Recession and COVID has disadvantaged African Americans and people of color and poor people much more dramatically than others. So, as you are well aware, when you think about home housing, house home, you've also got to think in terms of how all that affects people differentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and really, when you're thinking about really the only way for people without capital to accumulate capital in America is through home ownership, or at least that's the main way. I mean, I believe me, I've thought about this a lot in terms of, watching other families in my neighborhood start accumulating other homes and renting them out and realizing that that's how they were going to pay for their kids' college. And this was the name of the game. When you build all of the racial inequality in American history into those systems, it seems like, you can look at the maps of COVID just in New York City in terms of mapping how many people died. And it's by these neighborhoods. It's a map of that inequality. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. So it seems like, it's the homeownership seems like it's a way of almost hiding a lot of those structures. But more and more people are aware of it. I don't see it changing, though. I know that the racial covenants in Los Angeles still exist. They're still on the books, and there's a lot of great writing and documentaries about that. But again, it feels like the housing situation in Los Angeles is as bad as it's ever been, and same in New York. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking that I might be moving back to New York at some point, but I'm looking at rent for 2-bedroom apartments in deep Brooklyn for $4,500 a month, and it's just impossible. And that, to me, I think about people that are in positions worse off than me, and I just boggles my mind how people survive in America.
going back to that earlier metric of 3 times my beginning assistant professor salary and what it bought in Southern California, if a college were hiring now $70,000-$80,000 for a beginning assistant professor salary, where I'm sitting in Cambridge, 3 times Cambridge, Massachusetts, 3 times 70,000, 210.
Oh,
You know what that gets you in
right.
Cambridge? Nothing.
Yes, right.
Got to start at 450. And Cambridge is extreme, but it's not unique. But what you earlier said is really important in the history we're talking about, which is one of the things that fueled the Great Recession and the crash afterwards is precisely what you mentioned a few minutes ago. A family bought a house, let's say for $400,000, and this happens extensively in Southern California, in Las Vegas, in Phoenix, much of Arizona. As the value of the house goes up, this is earlier discussion about the house as commodity. The house became an ATM. And you could then go to a bank, or not necessarily a bank, but a mortgage lender, and borrow against the equity you had built, that had been built up. I'm not sure you built it up, that the financial system had built up, and buy a second and third home. And you know these stories, not untrue, especially in California, of a person earning very little money babysitting goes to a mortgage lender, and they say, "Oh, we'll mark you down as a $200,000 a year income." And I remember before the crash, the Great Recession, driving around in California and seeing these signs on billboards, no money down, 5% down. And I understood at the time the precarity that involved for the homeowner who might lose the home, but I didn't understand the precarity of the whole financial system that backed that. And that's that's what came crashing down. Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems impossible that that you could build something like that and make it last on those principles. It's funny because thinking about the way that houses are connected to American ideology and sort of the way the history of the last 100 years, but I'm thinking about the kitchen debate in the Cold War. And speaking of Walt Disney and movie sets. But Richard Nixon as vice president is sort of debating Khrushchev in this movie set at this American exhibition in 1959 in Moscow, and where it seems like that the countries at the time were competing. Part of the competition was like, look at how well our citizens live. Look how nice they have it here under communism or under capitalism. Which it seems like that game isn't so much a part of nationalism. I don't know if I'm wrong about that, but it doesn't seem like it's part of the national picture. I think in the same way.
International, the first world view of culture. Yes, absolutely.
Right.
I think when I was teaching, I used to use these wonderful film clips that I don't know if you know the work of Rick Prellinger, who is collected film strips, the film strips I saw in high school. And one of them is a wonderful one of 3 teenage girls standing around a kitchen, and they're talking about what paper to write for a class. And one of them says, "Oh, let's write about the freedom that choosing a dishwasher gives us." Right?
Right.
So that consumer choice becomes a key expression of freedom, and not, as you're hinting, not accidental that the kitchen debate takes place in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in the kitchen, right? And that Roosevelt, excuse me, that Nixon is bragging that what makes capitalism, the evidence that makes capitalism wonderful, is the kitchen and the freedom that the kitchen represents to enjoy all these goods. And that's very different from notions of public goods. That's private goods within the home. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, I forget the name of the book, but Catherine Beecher, you brought up in the 19th century, writing about this stuff. And she had drawings in this book that was like kind of prescriptive literature about what a home should be. And I just remember the kitchen diagrams were just really extensive. And I thought to myself, wow, this is 19th century Bed Bath and Beyond, in terms of ordering a home. And I know it wasn't all about consumer items, but at the same time there was something about the kitchen as being a sacred space for creating that home and happiness that's written into, I know, just not just notions of American freedom, but certainly has a certain Americanness to it.
Yes. And if you go from Catherine Beecher in the 1850s to Betty Friedan in the early 1960s, where the home becomes a trap and not a place of freedom, but a place that has trapped women. That's a major change from the home as sacred to the home as trap. But we've returned in the kitchen debate in the Soviet Union, and certainly in so much of the ideology of home ownership since then, to the home, if not as sacred, at least as aspirational. I want to talk a little bit about gender, and
you just did and touched on a little bit there, because I was thinking, how the kitchen become the comfortable concentration camp, right? Because that's right. Betty Friedan's words, because she's writing just right after the kitchen debate, right? Like, I mean, it's in that context.
She starts writing that in 1957, and the book comes out in 63. So she's very aware of that. One of the things that fascinated me in what I wrote was how it was women, and not all women, and not no men, how women as writers understood the precarity of the housing situation and the economy much earlier and more deeply than men. And if there are two heroes in the book, or two people I consider most favorably, one, and I stumbled on her, is an anthropologist and financial writer, a British woman named Gillian Tett, Tett, she is the American editor for the Financial Times, which is comparable in London to the Wall Street Journal.
And we're big Financial Times fans here.
Are you? Oh, then you know Gillian Tett. So she's an anthropologist studying anthropology at Cambridge, England, and she's in Tajikistan in the late 1980s, studying the impact of the Soviet Union on Muslim women. And just as the Soviet Union is collapsing, the Financial Times needs a stringer to write about the collapse of the Soviet Union, so they hire her. But eventually she moves as a full-time employee to the Financial Times, and she writes eventually a wonderful memo called the Iceberg Memo. And the Iceberg Memo is that above the water, what all the writers were writing about was mergers and acquisitions. And below the water is mortgage-backed securities, collateral debt obligations, and very few people were paying attention to it. And she understood what was going on as early as 2005, that is 3 years before the collapse. Was it because she was a woman? Is there some relationship between her and Ida Tarbell as another woman, or Susan Faludi, Pulitzer Prize winning writer, who also understood the precarity of the American economy at different moments? And Gillian Tett's not alone. And if there's one book you might read, or your people in your audience, it's a wonderful book by an anthropologist named Noel Stout. I got to make sure I get that right. Yes, that's Noel Stout. And it's called Dispossessed, How the Predatory Bureaucracy Dispossessed, How the Predatory Bureaucracy Foreclosed on the American Middle Class. Most people who wrote about, that is journalists I'm talking about, and documentary makers, who wrote about the financial crisis did it from a top-down perspective. That is, they focused on the Wall Street, Washington, D.C. axis. And access, AXIS, but access, ACCESS, is also very important because for most reporters, or many reporters, access to Lloyd Blankfein, to the people at the highest levels in the government and Goldman Sachs was really crucial. But there's a group of women, and Noelle Stout is among them, who focus not on the top, but on the bottom. That is the impact of the financial crisis, not on billionaires, but on ordinary people. And she did her field work around Sacramento, California, and one of the places where home prices had gone up so dramatically, and then looked intensely at bureaucracies, at mortgage brokers, at the government agencies, and how as the Great Recession has impact, how precarious life had become for so many people. So many of the key documentaries on the housing crisis focus on the top, not the bottom. But the other kind of film that most interests me, have you seen Parasite, the Korean?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, great stuff.
That's a great movie about, it's not about the United States, but it is. And it is about the financial crisis. So as you remember, it does visually so brilliantly these hierarchical layers in which people are living, from the very rich living far above the street level to the poor couple living in a cramped apartment where water is coming in. And within the house of the very rich family, living in the very deep basement, is a former employee who has been living there for so long. So you get this hierarchical structure of residential real estate from rich to poor made so visual. And
I loved it. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I didn't love it because it's such a damning sort of diagnosis of yes. capitalism and how it's structured and what it does to people. But yeah, watching the family sort of drowning in their apartment is just such an image of we talked about the COVID impact being a map of inequality. Climate change seems like it'll be the same thing, and more people seem to understand that yes. There are going to be people that are untouched and that win climate change and even profit off of it, and there are going to be people that lose their lives and lose their families, etc. And we can kind of predict who those people are based on how inequality maps out today.
Yes, yeah, and there are two other aspects that dovetail with what you're saying. One is the extraordinary story of the poor family that moves temporarily into the house of the rich while they're away, and right. learns the social codes that are necessary. And then, of course, it turns out that the rich family, because of secrets, is torn apart and eventually bankrupt by it's a metaphor for capitalism, right? How there is deeply embedded in it secrets, people with power who don't have power, deeply embedded in it problems that will lead it to be undermined. And I think that movie captures those dynamics brilliantly.
It really does. And yeah, it's also kind of a Rorschach test because, I mean, we're spoiling the whole movie, but towards the end of the movie, the young man who's from the poor family, whose father is trapped underneath these rich people's house, he's writing these heartbreaking letters to his father, and he's saying, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to buy the house eventually when I have millions of dollars, and then I'll free you. And to me, I was reading that as just so heartbreaking because I'm the cynical, pessimistic part of me, I guess, is thinking, oh, well, this kid will never, ever be able to work hard and buy the house. That's the whole point. But I had students in my classes who read it the other way and saw hope at the end of the movie and thought, well, yeah, maybe he will work hard and buy the $1 million house. And I thought, wow, that's how the engine just keeps moving because young people believe it.
But even if true, we'd then say, you and I would then say, here we go again.
Right.
Another case of social mobility that in the end I think the implication of the movie is, even if that happens, they will end up tragically.
Exactly. Like the dream itself is the problem. Yeah.
There are two other movies that play on this. One is Get Out.
Yep.
Which is more racial, not connected to the COVID, to the impact of the Great Recession, but also plays with this layers of upper, below ground, and above ground,
and homes,
and the terror of that. And the other one is a simply titled movie called Home, about a mother and a young son who. Mother has been raped, and that rape has produced this young son. Do you know this movie?
No.
Oh, you got it.
Is it a recent movie?
No, it's maybe by now 8 or 9 years ago.
Okay.
So the woman has been raped, and that rape has produced a child, and the mother and child are now in this home, this one-room house, and they can't get out. And reality to the son, who's about 6 or 7, has become only what he sees on television. He doesn't know any outside reality. And eventually the mother and child get out and move into the house, the suburban house. This first house is on the outskirts of Akron and very marked by the financial crisis. And when they escape, they move into the house where the mother grew up, which is a suburban house. And there's a very powerful play between this one captive house, and we see the problems of the suburban house as well. But
that's great. We're gonna check that out.
Yeah.
Daniel Horowitz, it's been really fun talking with you. You have a wonderful set of writing. I encourage all my listeners to check out all of it. But your latest book and your latest trilogy is all about consumerism and happiness and the shifts that are happening in the 21st century around these things. But your latest book is called American Dreams, American Nightmares, Culture and Crisis in Residential Real Estate from the Great Recession to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it just gave me a ton of things to think about. So thanks so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David, for having me.
Well, all right, my friends. I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to give a huge thank you to Professor Daniel Horowitz. That was honestly one of the more fun and engaging conversations I've ever had on this show after years of doing it. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And go check out his latest book and all of his stuff. Honestly, he's a really great historian, and I enjoyed talking with him. Thanks for everyone who is checking out the Nostalgia Trap YouTube channel, the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. Those links are in the episode description. Go watch Trap TV. Let me know if you like it. I appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.